Welcome back, everyone, to Frontlines and Faultlines. Following on from our initial conversation with Mick Ryan, a great commentator and deep thinker on strategic and military affairs, who's made an enormous contribution in the literature and the discussion on the events and issues that are challenging us at the present time. We began our conversation last time with the settings for the war, the initial phases of the war, the big strategic picture associated with that in terms of the geopolitics and dynamics. And now this week, we're going to talk about the lessons learned coming from the war, the technologies that have evolved in the process, and what Western militaries, and particularly what we like to call middle-ranking powers like Australia, can learn from the issue of confronting volumetric threats like the Russians pose to Ukraine. So, Mick, welcome back. And look, we've seen the asymmetric warfare phenomenon play out in an incredible way in relation to Ukraine's confrontation with Russia. What, firstly, would you describe as the main takeaways, the main features of the capabilities and the techniques that have enabled Ukraine to survive for this amount of time at least?
Firstly, I think it's not an asymmetric war, it's just a war. Asymmetry is a part of every war, just as attrition is. That's why I don't call it an attritional war. It's just a war. Attrition happens in units every day when they're at peace. So, I think clarity with what it is important. It's a war, very similar to every war that's gone before it. You seek sources of advantage wherever you can find them. If you want to call that asymmetric, you can. But at the end of the day, it's about seeking advantage through the clever use of mass, clever use of ground, clever use of time, clever use of technology, but more importantly, the clever use of cleverness. Having good strategy, having good tactics, enabling people to be innovative and fight cleverly and constantly learn and adapt. So I think that has been a very important part of this war. Indeed, I think one of the more revolutionary parts of it is the pace and the breadth of learning and adaptation that has emerged over the last 3 years. I think I'm about to publish an article for Lowy Institute, which proposes that, learning and adaptation may well be one of the RMAs that emerge from this war.
Mm-hmm, right. So I guess when people use that term, asymmetric warfare, they're really looking at things, for example, like the results that Ukraine has been able to achieve in confronting for the Black Sea Fleet, not possessing a navy of their own. And so how did they achieve that result? How have they managed to really blunt the the Russian naval capability?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the same way they blunted the Russians on the ground at the start of the war. They started using uncrewed systems to magnify the impact of the combined arms team and of humans. There's this myth out there that drones replace humans. They don't. They magnify the impact of humans and of existing systems. And that, I think, is one of the stories of the war that have been undersold by the media because they don't understand. They don't understand it enough, to be quite frank. So what the Ukrainians have done have magnified their capacity to find where the Russians are in the Black Sea and then attack them, focusing on what is the outcome they want, not so much the fleet they want to build, which is, the opposite of what Australia does. We focus on the fleet we want and then look for ways to use it.
Mm-hmm.
The Ukrainians at the beginning of the war, this was largely a land-centric war. My theory of the case is they said to the Chief of Navy, you go do Navy stuff. And he went, fine, I will. And he came up with all these clever ways of ensuring the Russians didn't have freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea. And that has involved multiple generations of semi-submersible and uncrewed surface vessels, the iteration of Neptune missiles, a dense ISR network, which brings in NATO information. They fly electronic warfare aircraft through the Black Sea all the time to collect. It's not just been drones. It's this integration of systems that have seen them pretty successfully push the Russians out of the western parts of the Black Sea, reopen trade routes,
Mm-hmm.
re-establish Ukrainian sovereignty over its own waters where they can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a great case study there. And I'd love to see navies like Australia, which can't afford most of the ships they're building
Mm-hmm.
and buying, to have a different balance of crewed and uncrewed systems. But we're not really seeing that. We're seeing that, rather pathetic, slow initiatives that result in one or two uncrewed vessels maybe in a decade, rather than really jumping on this and going, as a middle power, this needs to be our future.
Right. So, from your perspective, in terms of those really critical lessons learned in the future for Australia, that we're not really taking that on board or giving it the priority it deserves in terms of particularly that naval warfare aspect, given the importance and the criticality of our marine environment and sea lane vulnerabilities.
We're giving it zero priority. If you read the DSR that came out, Ukraine was not mentioned once.
Mm-hmm.
If you read the National Defense Strategy, it gets peripheral mentions, where if you read American and Japanese similar documents, it's front and center about what might we learn. Now, we need to translate that for our region, but there are trends here that are washing over us and we are not catching them. Indeed, you're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars being stripped out of Army from its drone programs to fund exquisite few submarines for the Navy. You're seeing Air Force spend billions of dollars on a very small, exquisite fleet of drones, the GhostBat. And you're seeing Navy buy, a couple of drones. I mean, this is a scandal. We are addicted to exquisite, expensive, crude systems when we can be more clever and be more balanced in the kind of systems we might be able to deploy.
And this was a great disappointment to me. I was heavily involved in the shipbuilding program when I had Defence Material, where we'd spent a long time looking at what we do post-Collins. And we'd done a lot of due diligence around military off the shelf and evolving the so-called son of Collins or future Collins successors. And all that work had been done, and we were going to move fairly quickly to a next generation conventional capability as an interim thing. But my view was, but by mid-century, we would be heavily into a phase of either really closely assessing or even deploying new generations of automated underwater systems that could at least deliver two of the three type operational functions that we expect from submarines. And what we needed was kind of like a bridging element to that. And, what I'm really concerned about is we lost a lot of time in this space through very, a charitable way to say it would be changing political approaches to that. Another way of saying it would have been catastrophic delay. But now we're looking at having to perhaps operate different styles of platforms at the same time, vastly different training regimes, and then overlapping perhaps with that transition and becoming redundant in a much more quicker frame. And perhaps the best part of AUKUS has been the arrangements of having visiting basing opportunities for British and American capabilities that exist now as a deterrent, and then perhaps having assets afforded to us to operate, even though 3 is not a very significant number in this context, but attempting to enter into a program with such a long timeline around it. I mean, is this realistic? Is this approach potentially being a drain on resources that could be deployed more effectively?
I mean, the fundamental challenge with AUKUS is the budgetary one. Australia, at 2% of GDP, which is current spending, and any growth over the next decade really just keeps up with inflation. It's not real growth. We can have AUKUS, or we can have the Australian Defence Force. We cannot have both. That is not possible. And anyone who tells you otherwise is just not across the reality of how budgeting works and how expensive it is to sustain both of these capabilities. So AUKUS is not only having a significant impact now on the readiness of the Australian Defence Force, it is strangling efforts for innovation to procure and test a wide range of uncrewed systems in the land, maritime, and airspace. So, AUKUS is having a very profound impact on the readiness and capacity of the ADF now, and will for probably decades to come, unless there is a conversation with the Australian people about increasing defence spending, which did not happen in the recent election, and this government does not appear inclined to have. And two, there is a significant budget step up. So, unless that happens, we're going to see a declining capacity in the ADF, not an increasing one. You're not going to see a nuclear submarine for a decade. And in that period, that is probably the most dangerous strategic circumstances Australia's faced in its history. Far more dangerous than 1941-42, because it's not just a physical, it's an informational and economic threat. And, we are not really investing in protecting our systems, our values, and our people.
Yeah, it is surprising when you saw all of the signalled urgency emerging from the DSR process and reforms, which in itself actually created quite a bit of delay. But, if you'd have seen rapid deployment and acquisition happening from it, you might have said, well, okay, but, we've brought extra delay through that process without the end result of the signalled urgency, and that, you would expect these forward estimates would be the most important ones of the entire defence spending process in addressing that. And we're seeing people talk about, the spending that will happen, in 10 years or etc. So it doesn't seem to be matching, the lessons that we were supposed to have drawn from the DSR. So a bit disturbing in that sense. On both sides of politics, and it didn't really feature in the election campaign as much of a discussion either. So we're not educating the public into that need, which is really underlines what you've just said. But I guess the other element to that is, and something that deeply concerns me, that I just never saw the understanding and the literacy around technology in defence or government around some of the really important lessons that I was able to be closely involved with or aware of in terms of the evolution at JADC2, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, Information and Decision Superiority, where, you were seeing these new platforms evolve that could merge all of the military and commercial surveillance ISR capabilities. So not just your actual military assets, but your commercial satellite assets like Maxar, MND, and Starlink, even, all of these being built in, and for the Ukraine it was kind of being provided through a curated channel through organisations like 18th Airborne, but built into a system that they were able to operate that wrapped up all of their target prioritisation and evaluation, their bomb damage assessment, their decision-making processes through command and control, wrapped everything, readiness, logistics, all into these platforms in a coherent, really integrated way. And they even managed to build into it their refugee management and war crimes investigation, the whole deal. And that, I know the Ukrainians said to people that I was working with that this was really critical for them. It made all the difference in how they were to be agile and deflect the Russian assaults. It wasn't so much of assistance when they tried to go on the offensive. It turns out, belt minefields are still belt minefields. But in your observations of that, do you see that as so significant, this JADC2 environment we see starting to appear in US COCOMs, for example, as well, but a lack of understanding of that in the Australian context?
Yeah, I think there's an understanding. We've had digital command and control system development for about 40 years, starting with OSTAX, then BCSS, and then a bunch of things with Albert, and now I think CITAware. But the reality is we don't have one. It's not down to the levels required, and you cannot win without that on a modern battlefield. Let's be very clear. Without a modern, decentralized and democratized digital command and control system, you will lose. It's certain, right? Because you just don't have the awareness. The Ukrainians, I think, once again, have shown us a way with this, and we've fundamentally ignored how they've democratized it down to every single individual on the battlefield with Kropiva, up to about brigade level, Delta from brigade level and above, a bunch of other systems which have enhanced battle space visibility, not transparency. It's a despicable term because it's not correct, but enhanced battlefield visibility. They've enhanced the ability of junior leaders to take decisive action without direction. It has closed the detection to destruction gap, streamlining kill chains as well as logistic chains and casualty evacuation chains. If you go to an Australian brigade, you're lucky if you get a node of digital C2 at the company level. You certainly don't get it down to the individuals like the Ukrainians do. So, we have certainly missed a trick here, and it is one part of what I call the transformative trinity from this war, which is, uncrewed systems, democratized digital C2, and the meshing of commercial and military sensors and analytical capacity. You combine those three, and they are transforming war. The character of war has fundamentally shifted because of it, and I think it is, yet another RMA which is emerging from this conflict.
And you made the point, in the Army environment, we did have an Elbit battlefield management system at one point, and it was deprecated and removed, and there hasn't been anything to really replace it up until now. And that was only in the single environment of Army. There's some fires control systems you'll find in, Air Force, etc., but there's still no joint command and control system that brings it all together. We're still hindered by these silo approaches to, actual command and control. And
well, there's a pretty fundamental reason for that. Politicians can't get their photos taken in front of it and tweet about it like they can a fighter jet,
right,
or a tank. And unless politicians actually start doing their job and we get a defence minister full-time in this country, which we haven't had for 3 years, we're not going to get that leadership and direction that the Australian Defence Force requires, unfortunately, at the moment.
Yes. And, that's, you're so right. I've written a bit about this in terms of the digital literacy at the political level, but also the senior bureaucrat level. And it's not surprising. You've got a generation of people who this has all come online and developed very rapidly and accelerated by the revolutions in artificial intelligence and the like, and machine learning and these new large language models, etc., that they find it hard to understand this in the first place. And one of the big holes, it seems to me, is the absence of the ability to evaluate what's going on and engage with industry, and then have the processes by which you can do procurement effectively. So I was really, there have been major dramas and mistakes made in US procurement that they've made movies about. But when it comes to high tech, I think they've really at least got best practice systems and the ability to engage in a probative way with industry in that. So you've got DARPA, the Defence Advanced Research Project Agency, able to go out there and scope the technical horizon and engage with industry and even set them goals. And then at the back end of that, to develop their RFTs, requests for tenders, in an informed way, so that they know what they're looking for, the over-horizon stuff, and then conduct a rigorous competitive bake-off amongst potential providers to actually get them to prove what they can do in delivering that, and then having sort of more limited 3-year contracts, etc., with reviews and requiring iterative, capacities, etc. And so you get, a more rapid evolution of demand from the operator end also being fed into what industry does. And I look at US Space Command, for example. You've got 4 cells that are dedicated to commercial engagement, where you'll have uniformed people even collaborating, working with companies to build algorithms and the like. And instead here, we have this extreme reluctance to engage with industry, the inability of the bureaucracy to run informed procurement and understand, what's evolving in the battlefield itself. So, how do we address that, Mick? What's the answer to that lack of capability and literacy?
Well, I think technological literacy is a real problem in the Department of Defence. It was certainly something I worked on when I was at the Defence College, and was an agreed problem by the Chief of Defence and Secretary. It wasn't something I made up. It was an agreed problem. I really like how the Ukrainians have done this with Brave One, which is a department set up by Minister Fedorov in the Department of Digital Transformation. They get out there, they talk to the general staff every week, know what the requirements are, search for technological solutions, do options testing with those, come back and brief them to the general staff, and at the same time provide um, uh, an uplift in technological literacy for that same general staff. So their requirements development is better informed. So, there's a model there, once again, from Ukraine that is better than DARPA. And our DSTG hates DARPA. It doesn't want that model. And,
Yes.
it's pretty much ensured the ASCA has not functioned well at all and is unlikely to do so in the future. So something like Brave One, I think, is a model we should look at. But fundamentally, the Department of Defence cannot fix this. It's had decades to do it. It has demonstrated an inability to do so. It requires ministers to intervene, to appoint leaders who will take risk and who will do things that are tough and might fail, but which we might learn from. But until we do those things, I don't see any prospect for any change in the Department of Defence.
I think you're so right. I've watched and been involved in a lot of forums and discussions around creating and evolving ASCA to sort of try and fill this space, and hearing comments about, yes, wanting to learn from DARPA. And at the recent ADISA conference we had, there were a lot of rhetoric around that and the urgency and acceleration and all these buzzwords used, but nothing really emerging from it. And so ASCA doesn't have the funding or capability to do evaluation of sort of innovative projects. And I saw them actually using a consultant to try and help them evaluate proposals, but they don't have the ability to actually develop those from a funding and staffing point of view. And still that cultural reluctance of the DSTG component of ASCA of talking to industry. This don't want to be compromised on pure science or whatever, so you've got these cultural impediments as well, which is, and the other thing, coming back to your point about the lessons from Ukraine, in terms of the development of platforms that we were providing there, you saw these really bright Ukrainians working in the tech industry internationally who came home to help with the war and were literally standing in trenches. And then the government understanding that and going out and finding them and saying, hey, you guys go and work with these providers and learn and see what you can contribute. And what we found was these guys were really bright and created their own Miltech startup capabilities. And so half of the issue there was incorporating that into the overall framework. The larger platforms that have taken these big companies like multiple years and billions of dollars to develop that Australians and Ukrainians can't do. But it seemed to me the lesson was the niche there that we can fill with. There's so many smart innovators in Australia as well, who all they need is that mechanisms to help marry them up with primes and build into systems their innovations and startup capability. And that just seems to not be happening either. There's no sort of mechanism for trying to find that going out hunting for that and actually actively marrying up Australian input into these things and then deploying hybrid platforms like that. But that can be part of a seamless coalition environment.
Well, yeah, I think one of the more terrible elements of the National Defence Strategy was this notion of a focused force. An intellectually bankrupt proposition. The reason we had a balanced force for so long was not about keeping service chiefs happy. I mean, that is it's a silly idea. It was about preserving the widest number of options to adapt and respond when you are surprised, because it is certain we will be surprised. And the more options you have, which is provided by a balanced force, not a narrow focus force, the more likely you are to successfully respond to surprise.
Mm-hmm.
What we have developed in this focus force is a focus on expensive, exquisite small numbers of platforms, a focus on crewed platforms, a focus on imported platforms, when we should be having a balanced force, not just the balance of capabilities, but a balance of crewed and uncrewed, a balance of sovereign and imported systems, and a balance of exquisite with cheap and mass. There is no indication that the Department of Defense or the Deputy Prime Minister, who doesn't want to be called Defense Minister, understands the 21st century environment, which doesn't encourage the more balanced approach, but demands it.
Yeah, it's a really important and powerful point, Mick. And I guess the other aspect of this too, which disturbs me, and no doubt, I know you've looked at this too, is this security of our systems and the evolving sort of cyber threat associated with this. And you've seen the Biden administration step forward with their zero trust regime, which is incredibly rigorous. They will go to a company and say, right, we're going to send in teams to red team your organisation and also test insider threat issues. And we're not going to trust you to say you can meet our standards. We're going to test you thoroughly. We're going to be really interventionary. And out of that process, it's been incredibly rigorous. In their first rounds of assessments, the only two companies have basically come through the gate. Microsoft in relation to what they're providing for US Navy, and Dell more broadly. But we've down selected a couple of companies in that process of the secret cloud, for example, who haven't passed that zero trust regime test. And we're already finding issues dealing with Indo-PACOM, who are operating to that system security regime and are not letting us into certain aspects, and they're evolving this Aloha Blue regime for their JADC2 environment. And there seems to be a lack of understanding too in Australia that we can't. You might not even be able to turn up to a coalition operation if you can't seamlessly integrate with these secure environments, or not effectively at least. And seems to be a lack of understanding of that too.
No, it's just an extension of our inability to conceptualize 21st century warfighting environment. But without that connected digital environment, you can't fight. You won't even get out of barracks, to be quite honest,
right.
Because the enemy will just shut you down. There'll be no transportation offshore, because that'll all be shut down. So, I think this is an area of significant reform and investment, but most importantly, significant leadership. And this is at the heart of every problem in defence, is the lack of visionary leadership, which assumes and takes risk and accepts that there will be failure as long as we learn from it. Unfortunately, that is not the political culture in this country anymore. No risk is a good way to win elections, not just in defence, but in any form of reform for industry and business. And therefore, that has kind of trickled down into society. We've become a zero-risk society, and it's hard to see how you can reform defence without reforming the entirety of society.
Yeah, and I think that's the most brilliant point you've made, Mick, is this. It actually points to a culture in Australia where we don't have the environment really that's good enough to grow the startups and innovation and commercialise them. In that sense, the venture capital is true venture capital. It will get behind failures and risk, not something that will just invest in something you think you're certain is going to be a winner. That's not what venture capital is all about, but it's that cultural underpinning that you service that really holds us back in that respect. But
yeah. Well, Donald Horne had it right 60 years ago, and I think it's only got worse since then.
Yes, so right. Look, Mick, that's been fantastic. I really appreciate your contributions on this generally, but for our viewers as well, if they want to be better informed on this. And you've been blunt, and I think that's what we need a lot more of, and politicians and our leadership should not be afraid of that. We have to encourage that kind of bluntness and honesty. So thank you so much for that. And, also I really salute your intellectual capabilities and capacity. You're one of the deeper thinkers we had in the Australian Army, the finest traditions of what Peter Lay tried to encourage. And so we really look forward to talking to you more in the future. And perhaps we'll talk in detail about the China-Taiwan dimensions as well. We're starting to tease that out too. So thanks so much, Mick, and we look forward to talking to you again next time.
Thanks, Mike. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Cheers, mate. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us on Frontlines and Faultlines, and we very much look forward to talking with you again next week. Cheers.